Kofi had traveled across forgotten forests for 3 days before reaching the abandoned village that no map dared to name. The entrance was marked by cracked stone pillars wrapped in dead vines, yet fresh footprints covered the dusty ground. Birds refused to fly overhead, insects made no sound, and even the wind seemed afraid to enter. Every instinct warned him to turn around, but the strange silence pulled him deeper like an invisible hand. He whispered his own name just to hear a voice, but the words vanished before reaching his ears. As Kofi crossed the first dusty street, he noticed cooking pots resting above cold fires as though families had disappeared in the middle of preparing dinner. Empty baskets overflowed with dried fruit untouched by animals. Wooden doors hung open, yet every house was spotless inside. It looked less like people had fled and more like time itself had frozen. Then he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, nobody stood there. The deeper Kofi wandered, the heavier the silence became until his own heartbeat echoed painfully inside his chest. He found strange symbols carved into walls, all pointing toward a giant baobab tree rising above the rooftops. Fresh scratches covered its bark as if desperate hands had clawed at it recently. A torn cloth fluttered from one branch despite the still air. He reached for it, and instantly every door in the village slammed shut at once. The thunderous sound echoed for several seconds before complete silence returned. Kofi rushed to the nearest doorway and found it sealed from inside, even though no one could have reached it. His breathing grew faster. The torn cloth in his hand felt warm, almost alive, and strange dark stains slowly appeared across its surface. He tried throwing it away, but it landed at his feet as though the earth itself rejected his attempt. Night arrived without sunset. One moment daylight covered the rooftops, and the next thick darkness swallowed everything except the pale moon above. Kofi lit a lantern, but its flame burned blue instead of orange. Across the empty road stood a single chair facing him. He was certain it had not been there before. Something unseen seemed to be waiting for him to sit down. Ignoring the chair, Kofi hurried toward the village square where a dried-up well stood surrounded by cracked stones. As he peered inside, he heard faint whispering rising from impossible depths. The voices spoke in languages he had never learned, yet somehow he understood every warning. They begged him not to listen if the silence ever started speaking back. A tiny pebble slipped from beneath Kofi's foot and disappeared into the darkness below. He waited for the sound of impact, but nothing came. Instead, another pebble shot upward from the well and landed beside him. Then another followed. Within seconds, dozens of stones burst from the opening as though gravity had reversed, surrounding him in a perfect circle. Kofi broke through the circle and sprinted away, refusing to look back until he reached the far edge of the square. His lantern suddenly extinguished itself. In total darkness, he felt cold fingers brush his shoulder, but when moonlight returned there was nothing behind him except his own footprints. Then he noticed a second trail of footprints walking perfectly beside his. The twin footprints led him toward an old stone shrine hidden behind thick vines. Inside rested a cracked mirror coated with dust. Kofi wiped the surface clean, expecting his own reflection, but the mirror showed only the empty room. He stepped closer in confusion until a face slowly appeared where his should have been, staring directly into his eyes without moving. Before Kofi could retreat, the mirror shattered into hundreds of glittering fragments that floated motionless in the air. Every shard reflected a different version of the village, some burning, some flooded, some completely buried beneath sand. One fragment showed Kofi lying unconscious beneath the giant baobab tree while an unseen shadow reached toward him. Then every piece fell at once, and from somewhere beyond the houses came the first human scream the silent village had heard in countless years. The scream echoed across the village, bounced from roof to roof, and then stopped so suddenly that Kofi wondered if he had imagined it. His pulse hammered against his ribs as he ran toward the sound, gripping his lantern with trembling hands. The narrow path twisted between abandoned huts where faded fabrics still hung on clotheslines untouched by wind or rain. Every doorway seemed to watch him like open eyes. When he reached the place where the scream should have come from, he found only a single clay bowl resting in the middle of the road. The bowl was filled with perfectly clear water, yet the surface reflected a sky full of black clouds while the real moon above remained bright and calm. As Kofi leaned closer, the reflection changed again, showing a shadow standing directly behind him. He spun around instantly, but the street remained completely empty. Unwilling to trust anything he saw, Kofi stepped away from the bowl and continued through the deserted settlement until he reached an enormous stone arch carved with faded symbols. The air beyond it felt colder, carrying the scent of wet earth despite months of dry weather. As he crossed underneath, every sound disappeared again, including his own footsteps. He stamped harder against the ground, but not even the scrape of his sandals reached his ears. Panic slowly crept into his chest. Then, without warning, he felt vibrations beneath the soil as if countless people were marching somewhere below him. The invisible rhythm grew stronger until tiny cracks spread through the dusty ground. Yet nothing emerged, and after several unbearable moments the strange movement simply stopped, leaving Kofi alone with questions that only deepened the mystery. Drawn by instinct rather than reason, Kofi entered the largest hut he had seen so far. Inside, he discovered shelves packed with untouched calabashes, woven baskets, carved masks, and neatly folded cloth as though the owners expected to return at any moment. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table covered in dust except for one spotless place where a hand had recently rested. He reached toward it, and suddenly the dust across the room lifted into the air, swirling around him in circles until it formed the faint outline of invisible people seated for a meal. Though he could not see their faces, he sensed their fear, their hunger, and their desperate silence. Then the ghostly shapes collapsed into drifting powder, leaving him gasping for breath. Kofi hurried outside only to discover that the village had somehow changed while he was indoors. The path behind him no longer existed, replaced by rows of unfamiliar houses stretching into darkness. The giant baobab tree that once towered over everything had vanished from sight. Even the stars overhead appeared rearranged into strange patterns he had never seen before. Fighting rising fear, he marked one wall with a piece of charcoal from his lantern. After walking for several minutes, he found himself back at the same wall, but the mark had disappeared completely. Instead, new words had been scratched into the clay by unseen hands. They read, "Do not search for the silence, because the silence is searching for you." The message refused to leave Kofi's thoughts as he wandered beneath the pale moonlight. Suddenly a low humming drifted through the empty streets, so faint he almost mistook it for imagination. It grew louder with every step, until the entire village seemed to vibrate with a melody sung by no visible mouth. The haunting sound carried sorrow deeper than grief itself, filling his eyes with tears he could not explain. He covered his ears, but the humming continued inside his mind. As quickly as it began, it ended, replaced by perfect stillness. Then he noticed something impossible. Fresh tears were also running down the carved wooden faces decorating nearby doorposts, as though even the lifeless statues had been moved to weep. Kofi stood frozen as the tears slid down the carved wooden faces and dripped onto the dry earth. The droplets did not soak into the soil. Instead, each one became a tiny shining bead that rolled across the ground as if pulled by an unseen force. Curious despite his fear, Kofi followed them through narrow alleys until they gathered before a weathered stone platform in the center of the village. The beads merged into a single pool of crystal-clear water, perfectly still despite the trembling in his hands. When he gazed into it, he did not see his reflection. He saw the same empty village, but every doorway was occupied by motionless figures whose faces remained hidden in darkness. Just as he leaned closer, every figure slowly raised one hand and pointed directly at him. A cold wave swept through Kofi's body, forcing him to stumble backward. The glowing pool vanished instantly, leaving only cracked earth behind as though nothing had ever happened. Then he noticed faint footprints appearing in the dust ahead of him, one after another, with no visible owner creating them. The invisible trail moved at a calm pace, inviting rather than chasing him. Every instinct screamed that following it was dangerous, yet remaining in place felt even worse. Gathering his courage, Kofi walked behind the mysterious prince until they stopped before a sealed, mud-brick hut with no windows and no obvious entrance. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as if desperate hands had tried for years to escape from within. As Kofi touched the scratched wall, a section of hardened clay crumbled beneath his fingers, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. The air inside smelled ancient, carrying the scent of dust, smoke, and forgotten secrets. His lantern cast long shadows across shelves filled with untouched clay jars stacked from floor to ceiling. Every jar bore the same strange symbol carved into its lid. While examining them, Kofi heard a soft tapping sound from somewhere behind the shelves. Tap! Pause! Tap! Pause! Tap! It was steady, patient, and unmistakably deliberate. He searched the room from end to end but found nothing creating the noise. Then all the tapping stopped at once, and every clay jar developed tiny cracks across its surface. Without warning, the first jar shattered. Then another exploded, and another after that until fragments flew across the chamber like rain. Kofi shielded his face and expected dust or insects to spill out, but instead streams of black smoke escaped each broken vessel and spiraled upward. The swirling clouds never touched him. They circled overhead before rushing through the narrow exit into the silent night. When the last jar broke apart, the room became unnaturally bright. Resting alone on the floor where hundreds of containers had stood was a polished stone no larger than a mango seed, glowing with a pale silver light that pulsed in perfect rhythm with Kofi's heartbeat. The moment he picked it up, the walls around him began to shake violently. Kofi barely escaped before the hidden room collapsed behind him, burying its secrets beneath tons of earth. Clutching the glowing stone, he stumbled back into the village square where the impossible silence had returned. For several long moments nothing happened. Then the stone grew warmer until it illuminated the streets with ghostly silver light. Every abandoned house cast a shadow except one. Drawn by equal parts curiosity and dread, Kofi approached the shadowless building and slowly pushed against its weathered door. It swung inward without resistance, revealing complete darkness beyond. From somewhere deep inside came a calm whisper that spoke only 3 words, each one clear enough to chill his blood. "Welcome back, Kofi." Kofi's hand froze on the doorframe as the whisper echoed through the darkness. He had never visited this village before, yet the voice welcomed him as though he had returned from a long journey. His mind searched desperately for an explanation, but none came. Taking one careful step inside, he discovered that the room was far larger than the outside of the building should have allowed. Endless rows of cracked wooden pillars stretched into the shadows, each carved with symbols matching those he had seen throughout the village. The glowing silver stone in his hand suddenly dimmed, as if something inside the house was draining its power. Then, from somewhere far ahead, came the sound of a slow clap. One clap, then another, then silence again. Refusing to retreat, Kofi walked deeper until he reached a circular chamber with a smooth stone floor polished by countless unseen footsteps. At its center stood a tall pillar wrapped in faded cloth that looked centuries old. As he approached, the cloth loosened by itself and drifted gently to the ground, revealing thousands of names carved into the stone beneath. The names covered every surface from bottom to top, each etched with impossible precision. Kofi scanned them in disbelief until his breathing stopped. Near the middle of the pillar, freshly carved and still coated with pale dust, was his own name. Before he could touch it, the entire pillar emitted a low vibration that spread through the floor and into the walls like the heartbeat of the village itself. The vibration intensified until tiny fragments of stone rained from the ceiling. Kofi backed away and watched as narrow cracks spread across the chamber floor in perfect circles around the pillar. Soft silver light seeped through the openings, illuminating symbols buried beneath the rock for generations. The patterns shifted constantly, almost like writing that refused to remain still long enough to be read. As he stared, memories that did not belong to him flashed across his mind. He saw empty streets, extinguished fires, frightened faces, and people placing their fingers across their lips before disappearing into darkness forever. The visions vanished in an instant, leaving Kofi shaken and unsure whether they had been warnings, memories, or lies planted inside his thoughts. Suddenly the silver stone in Kofi's hand floated into the air without his control. It circled the pillar once, twice, then shot upward until it hovered near the ceiling, shining brighter than the moon outside. The intense light revealed faded murals covering every wall of the chamber. The paintings showed the same village, thriving with life before a strange darkness descended from the sky. In every scene, mouths were carefully erased from the faces of the people, leaving only blank skin where lips should have been. At the center of the final mural stood a lone traveler holding a glowing stone exactly like Kofi's. The traveler looked identical to him, down to the smallest detail, yet wore an expression of complete despair. Heart-racing, Kofi reached for the floating stone, but it suddenly fell into his palm as though waiting for him to make a choice. The instant his fingers closed around it, the house trembled violently, and every carved pillar emitted a piercing crack. Outside, an invisible force swept across the village, throwing dust high into the air without making a single sound. The front door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Then, from the deepest part of the structure, a hidden doorway slowly opened on its own, revealing a staircase descending into absolute darkness. A cold wind rose from below, carrying one unmistakable message, spoken not in words but directly into his mind. The true secret of the village of silence had been waiting beneath the earth all along. Kofi stood at the top of the hidden staircase, staring into darkness, so complete that even the silver stone seemed afraid to illuminate it. The air rising from below was icy and carried the smell of ancient rain trapped beneath the earth for centuries. After a long hesitation, he began his descent, counting each step to calm his nerves. 10 steps became 50, 50 became 100, yet the staircase continued without end. Strange symbols glowed faintly along the walls, appearing only when he looked away and vanishing whenever he faced them directly. Just as doubt crept into his mind, his foot touched solid ground. Behind him, every stair dissolved into black dust, sealing away the path back to the surface. The cavern before Kofi was unlike anything he had imagined. Towering stone columns rose from the floor like the trunks of ancient trees, disappearing into darkness high above. Crystal formations jutted from the walls, catching the light from the silver stone and scattering it into shimmering patterns that danced across the chamber. In the center stretched a perfectly smooth lake, as black as polished obsidian. Not a ripple disturbed its surface, yet Kofi sensed movement beneath it, something vast gliding silently in impossible depths. He knelt to inspect the water, and his reflection appeared for only a heartbeat before sinking away on its own, as though pulled downward by invisible hands. A narrow bridge, carved from a single slab of stone, crossed the lake toward a lonely platform in the distance. With no other path available, Kofi stepped onto it carefully. Each footfall caused faint circles of silver light to spread across the dark water below, revealing fleeting shapes that vanished before he could understand them. Halfway across, the temperature dropped sharply, and a dense mist rose from the lake, wrapping around his legs. Through the fog he caught glimpses of abandoned huts, broken market stalls, and empty village roads hidden beneath the water, as though an entire second village had been swallowed by the earth. The vision faded as quickly as it came, leaving only endless blackness beneath the bridge. When Kofi reached the platform, he discovered a circular stone altar untouched by dust despite its immense age. The glowing silver stone in his hand suddenly grew hot and slipped free, floating above the altar without any effort from him. Beams of pale light spread outward and struck the cavern walls, revealing thousands of tiny mirrors embedded within the rock. Every mirror reflected Kofi from a different angle, yet none matched his movements. Some versions of him stood perfectly still, others looked terrified, and one calmly raised a finger to its lips, urging silence. Before he could react, every reflection turned at the same moment and stared past him into the darkness behind his back. Slowly, Kofi turned around. At first he saw nothing except the empty bridge disappearing into mist. Then the silver light dimmed, and a colossal outline emerged at the far end of the cavern, too distant to reveal its true shape, yet large enough to dwarf the stone pillars around it. The figure did not move, but the ground trembled beneath Kofi's feet as though acknowledging its presence. A deep vibration rolled through the underground chamber, shaking loose fragments of crystal that crashed silently onto the floor. The silver stone suddenly fell back into Kofi's hands, now covered with hairline cracks that spread wider every second. He realized with growing dread that if the stone shattered completely, whatever slept beneath the village of silence might finally awaken. Kofi tightened his grip around the cracked silver stone until its sharp edges dug into his palm. Thin streams of pale light escaped through the fractures, painting trembling lines across the cavern floor. The enormous silhouette at the far end remained perfectly still, yet its presence pressed against his chest like an invisible weight. Every instinct urged him to run, but there was nowhere to escape. Behind him stretched the endless black lake, and ahead waited the towering mystery hidden within the darkness. Then a sound finally broke the silence. It was not a roar or a cry, but a single, impossibly deep heartbeat that echoed through the cavern and shook loose dust from the ceiling. To Kofi's horror, the cracked stone answered with a heartbeat of its own. The synchronized beating grew faster until the entire cavern seemed alive. Waves spread across the black lake for the first time since Kofi had entered, carrying shimmering reflections that did not belong to the underground world. He saw familiar village huts, market paths, and the giant baobab tree, but everything appeared abandoned beneath a sky stained crimson. As the ripples reached the shore, they transformed into glowing lines that crept across the ground and wrapped around Kofi's boots. Instead of trapping him, they guided him toward a narrow passage hidden behind towering crystals. When he stepped inside, the heartbeat faded instantly, replaced by an unsettling calm that felt even more dangerous. The passage twisted deeper beneath the earth, its walls glittering with crystals that pulsed faintly whenever Kofi drew near. At first he thought the lights were random, but soon he realized they formed patterns, blinking in sequences like a forgotten language. Curious, he raised the silver stone toward them. Every crystal flared at once, revealing ancient murals etched directly into the rock. They depicted a lone traveler carrying a shining object through the same village centuries earlier. In the final carving, the traveler stood before the giant baobab tree and placed the glowing object into a hollow in its trunk. The next image had been violently scraped away, leaving only jagged scars across the stone, as if someone wanted that part of history erased forever. Kofi reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into a circular chamber unlike any he had seen before. The ceiling was so high it vanished into darkness, while the floor was covered with perfectly smooth white sand untouched by footprints. In the exact center stood a stone pedestal supporting an ordinary-looking wooden flute. It seemed harmless, almost inviting, until Kofi noticed there were no holes carved into its body. Despite that impossible design, a haunting melody drifted from it without anyone playing. The music carried unbearable sadness, filling the chamber with memories Kofi had never lived. He felt loneliness, loss, hope, and terror wash over him in waves, leaving tears streaming down his face before he realized he was crying. Unable to resist, Kofi reached toward the flute. The instant his fingertips brushed the wood, the music stopped. Every crystal in the surrounding tunnels went dark, and the white sand beneath his feet began to shift like water. Within seconds it formed a massive spiral, pulling him slowly toward the pedestal. He struggled to escape, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. Then the cracked silver stone burst with brilliant light, freezing the moving sand in place and saving him from being swallowed alive. As the glow faded, words appeared across the surface of the pedestal in shimmering letters that had not existed moments before. They read, "The silence is not the curse. The silence is a prison, and something inside is trying to get out. See you in the next episode,